welcome to this second session of the Vienna Humanities Festival, and I can promise you've chosen the right session. You're really going to love this this conversation. I dare say. Let me introduce my guest, Isabel Behncke, who is an evolutionary biologist and field primatologist. She's one of the world's leading experts of some of Homo sapiens' closest cousins, as we shall learn, and she is a fellow at the Grutter Institute. For the Grutter Institute for what, Isabel?
For human behavior and institutions.
For human behavior and institutions, there you go. And she is on the Scientific Advisory Council of Chile's president, President Boric. She was born in Santiago, and she received her doctorate from Oxford, her MPhil from Cambridge, and on top of all that, if that wasn't enough, she is currently rewilding an entire mountain south of Santiago. So we might talk about that a little later on. I can't even conceive of the project. But Isabel, welcome to Vienna. Welcome to the Humanities Festival. It's great to have you here. Can you tell us, first of all, your own personal story of how you became interested in bonobos?
Thank you so much, Misha. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here. We shall explore not only bonobos, but the links to Vienna specifically. So my interest in bonobos are, together with chimpanzees, our closest living relatives. And that's basically how my interest in these animals started. Through a combination of wanting to study humanities, but having a deep love for nature. And I think, if I'm to be completely honest, also for adventure. Because to study bonobos is a great adventure of the mind, an intellectual journey, but it's also a physical, geographical journey, given that they live in the heart of Africa, in Congo. So I never thought I would study bonobos, because when you grow up in Chile, there are no bonobos there. In fact, the only primate in Chile is human primates. But I grew up loving animals, and that is in great part thanks to a Viennese researcher who won the Nobel Prize in 1973, Konrad Lorenz, who founded the Lorenz Institute for Ethology. So my father used to read Konrad Lorenz works, and he even hatched geese in our home, replicating the experiments of Lorenz. He was showing that basically the geese get imprinted to a human if that's the first thing they see. So one day he did not take me to school because he was like, no way, the geese are going to be born, hatched in the house. My stepmother was rather pissed because they lived inside the house. Anyway, that's to give some background. I was interested in animals and philosophy and psychology, and there wasn't really a way to integrate these things. So I was building up to it. So
when you went to Congo to start studying the bonobos, how do you get to them? Where are they? What are they doing? How do you find them?
So you probably know chimpanzees, right? Chimpanzees are much better known than bonobos. They are sister species. And chimpanzees are distributed in West Africa and East Africa. Bonobos live south of the River Congo in DRC, what today is the Democratic Republic of Congo, ex-Zaire, which means that finding them is difficult. To study any animal in a tropical rainforest is also difficult. But the political situation of Congo has one of the implications is that long-term research in animals has obviously been very tricky. So I was very fortunate that to benefit from not Western ethology only, namely the Lorenz school, but also Eastern ethology. The Japanese people came to ethology earlier than the West. And so in the early 1970s, the Japanese were looking for, they understood that bonobos had to be studied in order to get a fuller picture of human evolution. And so there was one particular Japanese man, Takayoshi Kano, who was exploring Congo on a bicycle to try to find a place where bonobos would exist in great density, but they would not be poached. Because obviously these are long-lived animals that have complex societies and complex communities. So if you want to understand how they live, for a study site, it's less than ideal if they get killed regularly, right? So they established Womba in 1973, the research site where I worked in, and which is to date the longest running study site for bonobos in the world.
I'm still slightly struggling with the image of a Japanese man cycling through the Congolese jungle, but we'll leave that for another time. So they founded this field station, and that's where you went to study the bonobos. Now, before we get into bonobos' activities, when I see pictures of bonobos, to me, they look exactly like chimpanzees. They're very, very different in terms of their culture, but physically, what's the difference between a chimpanzee and a bonobo?
I'll give you a couple of tips so you can recognize them. First of all, chimpanzees have more variation in the color. If you see them gray, that's a chimpanzee, not a bonobo. Bonobos are almost always black-faced. They don't get gray. But the most important tip is their hairstyle. They have a kind of partition in the middle with a kind of like airplane type model. Once you see it, please Google bonobos chimpanzee face, and you'll see the difference. Also like a little pink reddish lip.
The bonobos. So the bonobos have pink reddish lips and an airplane hairstyle.
Yes.
For reasons best known to themselves. So just let me know, you get to this research station, you still have to find exactly where they are. So it's a struggle every day. You're going into the jungle, and of course, they don't stay in the same place, I presume.
Correct. They stay in the same general area, but a general, like a territory, so to say. But that's the size of, approximately the size of Manhattan. So that means that unless you want to, you don't want to provision animals, you don't want to give them bananas, because you don't want to basically change their behavior. And we don't tag them or dart them for several reasons. So that means that you have to follow them basically as they live their lives. So you walk, you find them with the help of Congolese trackers who are extremely good at moving in a forest that is rather difficult to find orientation because it's flat and it's very easy to get lost, basically. They know how to follow the animals. You gradually learn, and basically you follow them through the day. Given that it's the tropics, the sun sets and comes out at the same time every day. So that means that they get up more or less at the same time every day, 5:45 in the morning. You want to arrive to where they make the nests. They make nests or beds every night. So you arrive to that site, you wait for them to get up, and they start moving, and then eventually the group travels, and then you follow them in their movement. They move, they settle, they eat. They have a social life, they groom, they play, they have sex, they eat, they sleep, they travel, and so on, until they make the evening nest around, say, between 4:30 and 5:30-ish. And then you walk back to camp, which might be closer or further depending on where they have gone that day.
Right, so the very task of tracking them and observing them is a challenge in itself. But at least it looks like they're reliable timekeepers. So you can set your watch by them. That's very useful. Okay, so let's get into the substance. We've heard about how bonobos and chimps look differently. the airplane hairstyle. But culturally, they're extremely different. So give us the basics about what chimpanzees are like in their behavior and what bonobos are like.
First, I will start with the similarities, because given that they are sister species, we often emphasize the differences, but they are very similar in many, many ways. Some of the similarities we actually share with them. And then they're different in other ways, but I want to say that these differences have to be taken with nuance and complexity, because they are, as we are, or other animals that are intelligent and large brain, complex, and they adapt to different environments. So if they live in a drier environment, they might be slightly different when they live in like more wetter tropical rainforest. So with that said, both chimpanzees and bonobos are highly social. They form long-term bonds. They form friendships. Neither of them has the kind of pair bond, romantic pair bond that humans have, but they do have these long-term bonds. They form coalitions, a difference being that chimpanzees are very good at forming male coalitions. They're highly political animals. And they are basically, they run their societies through, you could say Machiavellian politics, but they're very good at forming male-male coalitions. Bonobos, on the other hand, are well known for forming female coalitions. And this difference is striking because, as I want to emphasize, they're both similar in kind of lifespan, size-ish, but chimpanzees are slightly more heavier, muscular. But both of them have a trait that humans certainly have, which is fission-fusion societies. Namely, they come together in smaller foraging parties, then they go apart, then they bring the whole community in this kind of dynamic way that obviously we can go at how humans do it differently later. So that's similar. And the other thing is similar is that when a male or a female is born, usually in any species, there's one sex that disperses. And that marks a very important difference, because think, if you're a male and you're born and you will stay in your original place of birth, that means that you will be related with the other males that are born there, by definition, because you will not move, right? So you have your uncles and your brothers, so that makes it easier to form coalitions if you stay in your natal place of birth. So both bonobos and chimps do that. So now think, why is it that chimpanzees form these male coalitions, whereas bonobos, the females migrate? So if you're a bonobo female at your starting adolescence, you leave your group, you roam and you do what we call group shopping. You might visit different groups and eventually you settle in a new group and you form bonds and friendships with other females in that group. And so that's very interesting, and it gives us some light into bond formation in mammals and how that might happen even if you're not brought together at birth or kin related.
So, and let's explore that difference between the male-oriented society and the female-oriented society of chimpanzees and bonobos. What does that mean in terms of conflict and conflict resolution?
So very famously, bonobos have hit the press because being called the hippie ape, the make love not war ape, the matriarchal feminist ape. Famously, bonobos use sex for several functions, but one of them is conflict prevention and conflict resolution. When bonobos get nervous, they have sex. And this can be readily observed in a zoo, because, for example, when they're fed, the keeper brings, if you go to Berlin Zoo, you can actually observe this. The keeper brings fruit, and everybody gets quite tense, because they're not sure, how exactly should you part this precious resource. And so, very similar to how humans may like tell a few quick, fast jokes at the beginning of a cocktail party to establish hierarchy, they effectively have like a few quick bouts of sex, very fast, not like humans that tend to do it after dinner. This is before dinner. It's true. And then they calm down, and then they have come food. So the sequence is different. It's different. Yes.
So, that's a very cool way of conflict resolution. What about the chimpanzees?
So chimpanzees, quite obviously, they also have sex. And they, recently talking to one of the world's most renowned chimpanzee field ethologists, they're claiming that some chimpanzee females also do what bonobo females do, which is what I was describing. It's called GG rubbing, namely genital rubbing. So, because most sex in bonobos is female-female. Male-female comes second in frequency. So chimps also do it, but not nearly as much as bonobos, because the level of latent aggression and the possibility of being killed in general, and I really want to emphasize that these are differences in degree, not in absolute black and white as a species. In general, the likelihood of getting killed if you are a chimpanzee by other chimpanzee is much, much higher than the likelihood of getting killed by another bonobo if you're a bonobo. So that's an important difference in social tolerance.
So, and within the chimpanzees, you say that they have a sort of Machiavellian politics. They also, of course, are more territorial in terms of defending areas or defending encroachment from other chimpanzees. Is that right?
So both species have territories. One of the differences is that bonobos, when they encounter other groups, I've observed what's called intergroup encounters, and there's tension. There's conflict and there's cooperation in humans, in bonobos, in chimpanzees, in genetic systems, at all levels of societies. I want to stress that. It's not that bonobos cooperate and chimpanzees have conflict, but it's how they resolve conflict and how dangerous conflict is in terms of the degree of escalation. So in chimpanzees, the territory is actually defended in a way that resembles much more early forms of human war. Primatologists call them proto-wars, in the sense that males will gang together, they will form typically an only male group. They patrol the outskirts of the territory and they go silent. So when you see this behavior, it really looks as if when you have like a group of guards exploring or guarding the boundary of a territory. If and when they find a male from another group, they might gang up on him and kill him, or sometimes also just there's like genital mutilation. It can be very aggressive, and there's images published in papers if you're interested. Because obviously this gives us light into what might have been early forms of human conflict. They don't do the kind of ritualized confrontation of equal numbers, say, of one community versus the other, as humans do. So that's an important difference. But for example, in the 1970s, when Jane Goodall was studying her chimpanzees at Gombe, at the beginning she thought that chimpanzees would be, in a way, kind of the new angels. The better angels of our nature was represented by these animals who we might have thought not to kill not to kill conspecifics. We already knew, I mean, she actually was the first one to observe and describe that they made technology. Very famously, she wrote a telegram to her supervisor, Like, saying, I'm observing reliably that these animals are using technology, namely modifying sticks to fish for termites and for ants. And at the time, we thought that humans were the only animal that made technology. So she said, either we need to redefine the term for technology, or for animal, or for humans. So anyway, that's one example of how our understanding of our own humanity has changed through the observation of chimpanzees and bonobos. And for example, what happened after her observation of technology use in chimpanzees is that she observed them in this behavior that we call proto-wars. Namely, in Gombe, there was the Gombe Wars that happened from 1974 to 1978, in which progressively a group of males of the community she was observing killed the community of males of the neighboring community and took over the territory. So that was, you can imagine how difficult and complex to assimilate.
So the Gombe Wars, as they're actually called, are wars amongst the chimpanzees from 1974 to 1978. I'm just wondering how it came to an end, whether they had a peace treaty or something like that, or whether it was winner takes all.
I think rather the second option in this case.
So,
maybe we can hope bonobos would have done it differently, but...
Now, there's something when we were talking in advance, there was something very, very interesting you said about why bonobos exist where they do, south of the Congo River, and what that means for evolution and for the way that life and culture emerges. Are you able to explain that a bit?
It's a beautiful and very difficult to answer question. The first thing I think to understand is that evolution obviously has been operating on planet Earth from 4.6 billion years, and it's an incredibly creative process that has created like all the beautiful lives that we see on Earth. But it's full of chance and of paths that are very difficult to predict. So we can describe what we think happened here, which is a very beautiful example of what we're talking about. Namely, what if you run the tape of evolution, how does it produce bonobos versus chimpanzees? How does it produce humans versus Neanderthals? How does it produce birds of paradise versus crows? And contingencies and chance have a big role. Namely, for example, here, the current thinking is that there was a population of apes that lived in what is today central Congo, and around 2 million years ago, the Congo River was formed. And so just by the formation of a geographical barrier, this is one of the processes that leads speciation, namely something happens, and there's group A and group B that are physically separated. And if you only add time to that physical separation, it's like if we're separated now in these two groups, eventually two different cultures would evolve in the way we interact, just group A, group B, without anything really objective that is separating us, apart from where you chose to sit. So that's one element, chance and physical separation. And the other element is economics, namely that the climate on north of the river differed from the climate south of the river, and south of the river appeared to be wealthier in fruit, namely the forests were wetter and had more fruit. So economics is important when determining, obviously, social dynamics, because it determines how dense the groups can be. For female mammals, it's expensive to hang out together because they need to, feed infants, and lactation and transport costs are high. So basically, higher fruit, the most basic point is that higher fruit allow females to be in the same physical space. You cannot form a coalition or a bond unless you are in the same physical space, because primates, we bond through, well, we tended to, until now, bond through physical direct contact. So that's why economics was a central point in determining that bonobos could at least have the possibility to establish female bonds. And if you establish female bonds, then these coalitions lead to the different dynamics that we have described. Does that make sense?
Okay, now I want to get to a really central issue here, which I know that you've thought a lot about. And this refers to bonobos, it refers to chimpanzees, it refers to humans, it refers to many, many species, and not just mammals. And that is the issue of play. Why is play so important, and what have you learned from your research about play, about us and all sorts of other species?
Thank you, great question. Well, play is fun, right? What is play? Play is fun. Play is a behavior that we do when we want to. Animals don't play when coerced. Animals don't play when they are scared. And play is this behavior that is exploratory and fun, that you can have solitary play. Children play with their own voices. Children play with toys. You have social play. We even have interspecies play when you walk your dog and you're playing with your dog. So the first thing is that play is an almost universal behavior that happens in homoterm vertebrates, i.e. birds and mammals. But bonobos do it not only when they're young, but also when they're adults. And we also do it when we're adults. And that is really rare in nature. What is common is that kids play, the immatures of mammals and birds, because play prepares you for adulthood. In play, you test yourself, you test others, you learn about the world that you are inhabiting. But it was usually thought that this kind of scaffolding for being mature. Once you're mature, you don't need to play, right?
So why do we play?
Right? Why do we play? Play is expensive. It's risky. You can have an accident while playing. In fact, look at, hospitals on Fridays and Saturdays. Or, mountain towns are full of people that have broken bones out of play gone wrong. Right?
So the point is, why do we continue in adulthood? That's the point. And do the bonobos tell us something about that?
3 things. The first is that play is fun, so that gives you a motivation to approach the new. That should not be taken for granted. Most animals, understandably, are neophobic. That means you don't want to approach the new, for very good reasons. Why would you? Being neophilic, having an instance in which the new is both desired and created, is an avenue for creation of new behaviors, for discovery of new technologies, and for new ways of social interaction. So the link between play and creativity is one reason, and that, of course, has been, I think, we can see it quite readily in humans. For example, here in Vienna, you have the most wonderful painting by Bruegel, painted in 1560, which is called Children's Games. You can go and see Children's Games, and it's the depiction of at least 50 different types of play, which I really think shows this combination of exploration of boundaries, exploration of new ways of playing. So just play and creativity is the first reason. And then play and social bonding is a very important reason. Animals that play together stay together. When you play, you are in this kind of heightened social positive emotion that creates a bond that is probably much faster than other forms of social interaction that have lower emotional intensity. So play forms friends, maintains friends, and allows you to learn about the world.
Now, I observed as you were talking that humans seem to have inherited quite a lot of the social, cultural characteristics of both chimpanzees and bonobos, i.e. we are both aggressive and we like having sex for conflict resolution as well. Now, I know you've warned me against generalizing, and I don't want to generalize, but it seems to me that we have inherited both characteristics, but also, I want you to link that, if you can, to the issue of what separates humans, i.e. the issue of being bipedal and the size of human brains.
So, as Misha said, we contain both apes in a way. So this is a metaphor, because we did not evolve from bonobos and chimpanzees. They're not our ancestors, they're our cousins. So that is the metaphor that is very useful to think. When you're cousins, you did not evolve from your cousin, you share grandparents. So we share grandparents. And given that we share grandparents, we share these traits that are distributed. So that's why it's useful in a way to think about that, you contain both, because you contain this array of behaviors. And then, of course, humans, we always take things to new, bigger, better, more complex dimensions. The first one is that the particular evolutionary path that we followed means that we became bipedal and our brains increased in size. And that is very important, because a bigger brain, of course, we all love our bigger brains. We have 1.5 liters on average of brain, which surely we're very proud of, because it allows us to do the beautiful cultural things that we do. But a big brain is also expensive, meaning that calorically, for an animal to maintain a brain our size, you have to eat a lot of calories a day, much more if we were the same size of animal and we had a smaller brain. Then you could maintain your brain eating lettuce, so to say, or grass. It's not that expensive. But for a brain our size, basically, we started eating foods that were higher in calorie. Therefore, we started cooperating more. So there are several reciprocal links between cooperation and the kind of foods that allowed us to grow our brain, including our discovery and use of fire as a technology that allows us then to start cooking and then allows us to form the kind of social environment that happens around fire and storytelling and the night, which is another story. What I'm trying to point out here is that our particular path of bipedalism and brain size and the economics of brain size means that we cooperate more, but we also form coalitions and compete against others. And that means that our societies start getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And we have very complex dynamics between having a small group, which is core to us, our community, embedded in larger groups that have different meanings. So these are complex societies, and these dynamics between smaller groups and larger groups is a very important difference between humans and chimpanzees and bonobos.
Now, I don't want to extrapolate. I've got 2 more questions before I throw it open. I don't want to extrapolate too much on this, but we had a discussion yesterday about, because of the fact that you have to invest so much in rearing a child as a human relative to the bonobos, because it takes longer for the brain to develop and expand to its maximum capacity, then you were suggesting that that this might be one of the reasons why humans focus on the idea of finding one partner, as opposed to seeing everyone in the group as a potential partner in an before dinner or after dinner or whatever. Is this the idea of the romantic, the idea that there is one person for you, entirely culturally determined, or is there an element of evolutionary sense to the idea?
Well, I can only get into trouble here. But yes, of course, we think, there is so much cultural difference, obviously, but the evolutionary element is, well, very evident. And it starts with what we have been talking, namely economics of how expensive it is to maintain large brains and how expensive it is to rear human children in comparison to, say, other animals that would not require the extent of care in several ways. The first one, obviously, is the amount of time. You know, just look at deer, look at most hoofed mammals and the amount of time the infants require direct investment and protection from mostly females. In mammals, it's mostly females doing the care. In birds, it's a different story, and in that way, we're more similar to large birds in that you have biparental care. So it's the time, and it's also the economics. Namely, they are calorically expensive. When we talked yesterday, I was thinking, as a biologist, thinking, expensive to me is calorically expensive. So I said to Misha, they're expensive, and he was like, oh yeah, tell me about it. But of course, you know, I meant calorically expensive when you compare to other animals. And this time of being kind of slightly useless also is the time when kids, of course, play. And so you start seeing the reciprocal links of why the evolutionary process created this animal that, you know, we have a rather strange life history. We live long, we have long, extended, protracted childhoods in which we play, and then we take some of those elements into adulthood. And I want to link this, sorry, with your previous question because I think it's useful. So in that way, humans, you know, we have this, our evolved psychology is an evolved psychology that developed in small groups, of which the type we have been talking about. So we feel very strongly about our kin and our friends because we evolved in small groups. So that's kind of like our minds, the mind of an ape. But at the same time, we live in very large societies which are more similar to the large-scale societies of ants. I'm drawing a metaphor here, but of social insects, in the same way that, you know, we are almost 9 billion now, and we establish identities without knowing each other at a, you know, in a personal level. So I think it's important to consider that paradox. In a way, it's inherent.
Great, Isabel. I've still got one more question, which I'm going to come back to at the end, if somebody from the audience doesn't ask it. But, but otherwise, I'm throwing it open to you guys firsthand. Surprise, surprise.
Thank you for the fascinating talk. This question relates to the center you're working at now, human behavior in institutions, and also the peculiar human institution of zoos. You mentioned the bonobos in the Berlin Zoo. And have you studied their behavior, how it changes when they're captured in these zoos and over generations? You've had 50 years to see them in the wild, and I don't know how many years they've been in these human institutions.
Great question, thank you. So the question was bonobos in the wild versus bonobos in captivity. So I'll tell you an anecdote. I first started studying bonobos in captivity for obvious reasons. They're very difficult to study in the wild. And I read the literature, so it's all about bonobos having sex and their sexual lives. So when I first go to study bonobos in the wild, I'm like, where's the sex? I thought, I've been cheated. And this is an important observation in relation to your question, because basically in captivity, they are not allowed to engage in the fission-fusion dynamics that are inherent to bonobo society, which allows them to engage, to do conflict resolution. So famously, conflict resolution in bonobos has to do with sex, but also not being there. It's a very effective way for conflict resolution because of the physiology of aggression, basically. So bonobos, they're not always together, they separate, and then they come back together. So if you keep an animal that is used to basically coming together and then separating and meeting either hours later or sometimes days later in a smaller place, you have more conflict. And in bonobos, if you have more conflict, you have more sex. So it's a joke, but basically I think they're much more stressed in captivity than in the wild. And it was very interesting, for example, to think of that and what happened to us in the pandemic, because effectively we were captive apes. We could not engage in fission-fusion sociality. We couldn't go out and, you meet your friends for breakfast, then your colleagues at work, then maybe extended family, and you're doing the same kind of complex movements that these animals do. But so that's my observation. Although they're provisioned in captivity, that also increases stress. I do not know how then it passes down the generations. We haven't had the time to really study that. Yeah.
Questions? I see a hand at the back there. Try and be as clear as possible when articulating your question, because the sound here is, and I've got a cold so I can't hear anything anyhow, as long as Isabel can hear.
Okay, I'll try to manage your expectations. Just two quick questions, but I fully understand if you only answer one. First one, is there such a thing as sexual violence during conflict among primates as well, that is somewhat comparable to what we're seeing among humans? And the second question relates to our elections tomorrow. Can they tell us something about the thinness of civilization, or where do we have to stop drawing parallels between us and them? Because as you said, we're cousins, not twin brothers. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. So the first one, there is, as I understand it, if there is sexual coercion, sexual aggression, we haven't seen what we might call rape in bonobos, but definitely we have seen what we understand as rape in other animals, including chimpanzees and possibly dolphins, and birds as well. So the answer is yes to the first one. In relation to your second question, of course, I cannot predict anything. I don't have I cannot predict the future. I only see the past and the present. But of course, we have gained a lot of understanding about current social dynamics through the evolutionary lens, for example, in coalitionary behavior. And that's why I was mentioning ants and apes before. I think it's a useful way of thinking about it, because basically our minds are coalitionary. So we establish coalitions within our groups, and then of course we have identities, and we display those identities with a multitude of symbols. And so often what happens today, if you think of human behavior in technology, is that we're using symbols and issues not to really talk about the issue itself, but to sort out which coalition you belong to. And that is extremely useful and dangerous at the same time, because of course determining which coalition you belong to in past times was very important to your survival. So that's the only thing I want to say at the moment, because just for you to, when you look at social media and behavior in technology, you can start seeing basically what there are these displays of coalitionary belonging, and part of them are also, which one aspect of them is moral signaling. How good I am in relation to this issue, which I am right and you are wrong. It's a way of sorting basically our groups of belonging. And of course, given that we have an amplification technology, we're using these emotions that were used in small-scale groups that then fissioned, and now we keep them going. So that's obviously why it's
on a huge scale.
On a huge scale, permanently in our minds, that also project into the future. That's
I mean,
part of the
you may not be able to answer that, but just following on this, that scale and that, you know, the permanent heightened sense of signaling and conditioning behavior, do you think that might be related to increased levels of stress in all of us?
Absolutely. Absolutely, because you're using these emotions that typically would occur only at certain times. And then say you go into find fruit in the forest. To amplify them, to keep the signals of them everywhere, but also our minds, human minds, I mean, travel into the future and into the past probably a lot more, thanks to language, than other animals, which means that we're also forecasting, projecting. So the combination of those two factors makes it incredibly stressful and paradoxical if you think how much wealthy we are and secure in comparison to these animals. So yeah. Why are we having a worse time?
Questions here?
Wait, I'm sorry, I have to think for a second because I just forgot my
That's okay.
thoughts. What's the difference between a chimp? Why are chimps more aggressive than bonobos? Is it hormones or is it the way that they're cultured?
Is it hormones or
a cultural
the way
thing?
They're cultured?
That's a great question. We're still trying to answer it, but basically these are separate things. Nico Tinbergen, who won the Nobel Prize together with Konrad Lorenz because of their work here, he taught us a way of thinking that is useful to your question. Separate the how, the what, and the why when you ask this question. So how things work is physiology. Testosterone, for example, is a description of why certain species or certain individuals might be more aggressive than others. So that's description of mechanism. This is why it works. Why is the evolutionary question, which is why did it develop to be in such a way? Which the answer is more like what we were talking at the beginning. Oh, first they separated, then you have economic drift that creates different societies, and that leads us to the cultural question, which is why is it maintained? And cultural animals, we create a niche, which is cultural, that makes us to adapt to the same niche. Once you have a culture, you have to belong to that culture. So that also reinforces a certain type of behavior. So I'm sorry if this answer is not clear-cut, but basically both are the answer, but they operate at different levels, if that makes sense.
There and then Casper. So just there first, because his hand was up first.
Thanks. What does this study of different primate types, chimpanzees, bonobos, maybe any other different kinds, teaches us humans about what are the possibilities to, or approaches, or perspective approaches to conflict resolution? I mean, this is a big stretch, a big bridge, so maybe what it hints us towards. Do the differences in environment can stimulate more collaborative behavior, maybe within the variation of bonobos, because there is some self-replicating culture, I assume, but the different pushes and shifts in environment might stimulate or destimulate certain behavior. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great and complex question, and I think the first thing is at what group size you're asking the question. Because obviously conflict resolution within a family or within a couple is a different problem than conflict resolution between institutions, nation levels, or cultures, the kind of size that we're seeing today. At smaller group sizes, whether a dyad or a small group, we often think communication. I do think that fusion is a very good tool, namely not being there and then coming together afterwards because of physiology. Go do something else, come back later, and I think fusion really works. At greater levels, it's obviously that's not going to be enough. And it's a lot more difficult, and that's where I think institutions play a crucial role in reinforcing the kind of cultural norms that at least keep us from escalating further. Primates did not evolve those kind of stops, because there are no primates that have ever lived in the kind of group size or have the kind of power of weapons, both physical but also technological, as we do now. So I think it's our challenge to solve.
Casper.
Thank you. You already mentioned that bonobos use technology, and chimps, I think, also use technology. Is there something in bonobos that resembles, let's say, aesthetical behavior? Do they, I don't know, maybe in their sexual, do they try to make themselves sexual, appealing, beautiful? Do they, I don't know, are the moments of enjoying the beauty of nature or something like this, or even something that resembles art production?
Wonderful question. I see two questions there. The first one is that if they use technology, so bonobos they have the cognitive capacity to use technology. It's just in nature they use it less than chimps, but for example, they use leaves as umbrellas when it rains. They hate they hate the water, which is funny, because they live in the tropics. So, so anyway, that's one example of technology used in bonobos. In captivity, they can break nuts with stones, which chimpanzees do in the wild. So they have technological capacity. Nature and aesthetic appreciation is a wonderful question. I think they have aesthetic preferences, or at least abilities. At the most basic level, if you're a fruit eater, you have a capacity to distinguish color. And also, bonobos, different from monkeys, eat ripe fruit. So a fruit that is ripe is redder than greener. So at the most basic level, I think we can ascertain that there is a preference, right? Then at another level, it's just speculation. But for example, in play, I've seen examples that you can fathom an aesthetic preference. For example, in water, they play with water, which is interesting because they don't like water normally. But they play with water in a kind of soft, exploratory manner where, whether they can see their own reflection or not, then it's their own guess. But I do see that there's like kind of an aesthetic enjoyment of it. That's why play teaches us so much between the link of play in animals and creativity in art in humans, because of the development of the aesthetic sense. I think the building blocks are there. Yeah, if that makes sense.
Isabel,
Yes.
Or who they want to have sex with, or is it largely
No, they show very clear preferences. So I could show you, but the networks of play, they play with lots of different conspecifics, but they have clear preferences. They are very socially tolerant and very playful, so that means that almost everybody will have at some point play with everybody, but the preferences are clear. I think it has to do with styles, and also you say young males play in a certain way that tends to be more intense and so on. So, you have these dyads that almost always play together. And in sex, you also have preferences. So as I said, female-female sex is more common, but certain females, it has to do with age and dominance hierarchies, and I think also preference. Yeah.
Who is more aggressive, the human ape or the chimpanzee ape? And who is less aggressive, the human ape or the bonobo ape? So I see 3 apes, but only 2 comparisons. So my question is, where is the human ape? Is the human ape the most aggressive?
Thank you. between chimpanzee and bonobo apes, bonobo apes are no angels, but we can say, I think now, that they are less aggressive. They have almost no or very little infanticide and almost no or very little homicide, right? So whereas chimpanzees have both. Again, we might see more in the future just because we have little research, but what we know now, at the moment, there is that difference. I think it would be easier to say that human apes are more aggressive, but do a thought experiment. There is a way in which human apes are not, they're actually less aggressive than chimpanzees. If you are a primatologist in Vienna, go to a bar, go to a restaurant, and what do you see there? That there are people that do not know each other, and they're in small groups, and they're male groups with other male groups, and most of the time, they're not killing each other, and they're not fighting most of the time, right? That is very rare. That could not happen in chimpanzees. If you bring different groups of chimpanzee males into a bar of a restaurant, there'd be like a huge fight. So that's part of the paradox of our modern culture. In fact, humans are very peaceful. You travel through a train station, you go to an airport, most of the time you're in crowds of people that you do not know. And most of the time, there's no overt aggression. Obviously, I'm very aware of wars and the level of large-scale killing that we do. But I mention that because it's worth having in mind that we also do this other thing, where we're incredibly peaceful with strangers a lot of the time, or most of the time.
Isabel, on that happily optimistic note, which I wasn't quite expecting, let me ask everyone to give you a huge round of applause for what was a fascinating discussion.